Welcome everybody, my name is Scott Maier. This is Drawing Together with Artist Network, where we meet every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. Today we're working on this barn. Now I can't be with you here live today, so I had something that came up, a conflict where I couldn't be with you live, so I'm recording this and airing it at our normal time. So what you're watching is a recording. I will do my best to answer any questions that come in the chat of the video though. So check back for those. So again, this is what we're working on. This drawing of this barn. So here at Drawing Together, we meet every week with a new challenge to advance our skills in a particular way. So we choose a subject that's designed to focus our attention on a particular skill. And in this case, we're going to be working on perspective. So it's a fairly simple form. It's not the most complex of subjects, but it does have some tricky elements that I think will give us a great opportunity to practice. So today I am working on toned paper. So this is the tan toned paper by Strathmore. I'll be working in charcoal. I've got this fancy extender so I can reuse some of the shorter pieces of charcoal that I have building up here in the studio. And I've got a couple, so I've got a medium and a soft charcoal that I'll be working with. I have my vine charcoal as well for the initial phases, as well as some white charcoal for some of these highlights. Blending stump, this comes in really handy, especially with some of the kind of the more delicate work. I also have my erasers here. So I've got my retractable rubber eraser that I have carved down into this sharp edge for some of the finer edge work. I've got my kneaded eraser to help keep the paper clean, and this great vanish eraser here. This is a rubber eraser that works really well for lifting material. And then a couple other really helpful tools. I've got paper towel to help smudge, and then for a straight edge, I'm just using this strip of paper. It's a relatively thick kind of cardstock like paper that I'll be using for some of the straighter edges. So I'll kind of go through how I use that in this process. So the whole point of this show is that we're drawing together. It's not draw like me show. So again, I'll kind of talk through what I do and kind of some of the things that I'm discovering as I go along to see if they're helpful for you. But I encourage you to use the materials that you prefer and the process that you prefer as well. So let's get to it. All right, so I have a big reference up here on the left. I've got the screen in front of me that has the overhead camera. So I'm going to be actually drawing from that overhead projection, the same view that you're seeing right now, because that's vertical. Just as all my drawings start out, I'll be working with a gesture. So just using the vine charcoal, I'm going to be reacting to these forms. Now, in order to kind of focus more on the barn for you all, I'm going to kind of enlarge this a little bit. I'm playing with the composition, maybe cropping off a little bit of the right of the landscape. I kind of prefer the overall composition in the full reference photo that you're seeing below me here. And you can also find that reference image in a link in the description below, where you also find a link for the Drawing Together landing page for this episode, where you can share your work when you're done. So if you're drawing along, I'd love to see your work, and you can share it at that location. So what you might be observing, if you've been with us for a while, is that you can see that I'm building this using lines, not using large masses of value like I have often done. Now I'm going to be bringing that in, and one of the reasons I'm using the vine charcoal is that it's very light, so I can wipe this away fairly easily, and I'm just using the side of it to hopefully make it a bit lighter, so it's going to be easier to erase off. So again, I'm kind of expanding the drawing a little bit, expanding the barn so we can really lock in on that perspective. There's not much happening to the right or left in terms of perspective that's really critical, although that road could be a little bit tricky, and I can talk a bit about that later. So this first step, I'm just kind of laying in some form, so now I can start to correct it, and I'll talk through some of the things that I think about when I'm working with perspective. One of the main things to establish is your horizon line. So if you have a relatively flat piece of ground just like this, and you're looking straight across it, your eye level will roughly correlate with the horizon line, if you can see that far. And that's really critical because you want to develop a an intuition for perspective. So be able to look at these angles and get a rough understanding if they're at least in the ballpark, and then you can use linear perspective and kind of dial that in using kind of a more rigid system like linear perspective. So what I mean by that is if I look at this basic structure and I've established my eye level, there are a couple basic principles that I can quickly assess and utilize to assess the basic perspective. And one of them is the idea that in linear perspective, two parallel edges will appear to meet at a single point if you extend them far enough. So here, for example, we have these edges here for the barn that are literally parallel with one another on the barn. You know, so if we strip away our point of view, any perspective, we know literally that the top of the barn, the bottom, and then the roof line here are parallel edges. So that in following the rules of perspective, if we were to extend those lines far enough, they would appear to meet at a single point. And that point is going to be on that horizon line because this building is built on the ground plane. It's one of the other parallel elements in this whole system is that ground plane. It's sitting parallel to it, so it's going to meet at a point on that horizon line. So what I can observe from that is there's this quality of these edges that seem to radiate from a point. So if I imagine a point somewhere off here, I haven't dialed it in, I don't know exactly where it is, but I can imagine one over there, and then these lines would seem to radiate, they kind of fan out from that point. So if you're above your horizon line, it should angle out and away to meet at a common point. If you're below, it'll angle up and away. So right away I have a basic structure established, and now it's just a matter of kind of tweaking those points. And then the same can be applied to this side here. So now we turn 90 degrees from this corner, and we have this line here, we have this kind of implied line here, and we have an implied line that connects the two bends in the roof line here. So if we connect those this way, it creates a line. So we have these three lines now that would have that same basic quality, would angle up and out from below the horizon line. As you come up, it seems to fan out from that point, and so is angling down and away, getting steeper as we move up. Okay, so that's what I'm looking at right now, or just is that basic structure established. Now I can go through the process of refining it even farther. I think what I'm going to have to do actually is make this a little bit smaller, just because I'm going to get a little bit too tight up here against that, against the top of the page. So I'm going to start by angle sighting that roof line. And I'm just going to let that line run long because right now I know the angle, but I don't know how long it needs to be, and I need to start to establish some intersection points. I think what I'll do is I'll establish a vertical axis that represents the center of that barn, so I know where the peak is going to be, and I can build out from there. Let's see. So I'm going to angle sight. Actually, I'm going to use the smaller thumbnail. So when I'm angle sighting, I'm just closing one eye to flatten my depth perception. So I'm aligning this, I'm placing it visually directly on top of my reference image. Oh, I gotta move that down. I got kind of caught up in my old drawing. And I'm kind of, at this point, I'm kind of going by feel. So I'm looking at the angle, but in terms of the length of these edges, I'm going by what feels right, and then I can double check. So now we have this intersection point and this intersection point that makes a distinct line that way. I did not do a very good job creating that vertical axis here. So let me kind of sharpen that up. All right, let's see how that starts to feel. I'm going to apply it to, actually I'm going to stick on this side. And that feels about right. A little bit, that was a little bit too steep. All right, so now one of the really helpful tools in this, when drawing structures in perspective, is to find perspective center. So if I were to draw a rectangle, this is not drawn in perspective. If I were to draw a rectangle, if I connect the opposing corners, that intersection in the center is the center of that rectangle. Now we can take a rectangle that's drawn in perspective and find the center as though it's drawn in perspective by doing the same thing. So if we were to connect these opposing corners, it should run right through the center of that line. So that means that I've roughly placed that center line properly as drawn in perspective. And that's important because with this wall receding away from us, it's gradually getting smaller as we recede, and so that we're not actually placing a dot directly in the middle. We don't measure the distance between these two vertical edges, cut it in half, and that's the center. We have to put that in perspective. So that means that front edge is a little bit larger, that back edge is a little bit smaller. So this distance here is shorter than this distance. So when you use that process of finding perspective center, it helps you to adhere to the distortions in perspective that align with the optical truth of the subject. And we'll talk a bit about that, the difference between the optical truth and the literal truth of a subject. Now, before I move on to that next side, what I want to do is I want to compare the lateral distance between this back edge and the front corner to the front corner to this back edge. So I'm going to use comparative measuring for that. So actually I can do this. I can actually, I think I need a longer, I'll just use this tool here, aligning this edge with the left side of the barn, sliding my finger down so that it aligns with that front corner, locking that distance, bringing it across, and then aligning this side with that front corner and comparing it to that back edge. And so what I'm observing is that if this becomes our standard unit, if that becomes the distance that we measure, we carry across, that back corner is about 2/3 of that distance across. So if I kind of indicate that, I kind of have put that little smudge there. If I approximate 2/3, that puts us right about there. Now this is all fairly loose. You can see these lines are they're pretty fuzzy, so I don't have a very sharp, precise line. But I want to just get myself in the ballpark for now. So now I'm going to start from the ground plane, work my way up in terms of getting the angles established. All right, so these angles that I got were pretty accurate from my gestures. I can see my old lines. They're not placed in the right spot on the page, but they're not all that far off in terms of the specific angle. This one is a little bit off, and the roof line gets really tricky. And I want to talk through that a little bit. But I feel like angle sighting really goes a long way in terms of creating accurate perspective. Oh, I got confused there. I missed the target. So I got to clean up some of the excess lines. My arm keeps getting in the way. There we go. I think I need to become a little bit more steep. With this roof line, we still have that same principle of perspective that we can hold in our minds. This front edge here is parallel with that back edge. So if we extend them far enough, they should appear to meet at a single point. Now, this is not parallel with the ground plane, so that means the vanishing point's not on the ground plane. So the vanishing points on the ground plane are only with edges that are parallel with the ground plane. So we have vertical edges, we have these sloped edges. If they're parallel, they will still appear to converge at a single point if you were to extend them far enough. But you have to also pay attention to the role that the ground plane plays in that whole system. And so what that means, though, is if we extend them off to the left here, they should appear to radiate out from a point there, which makes each one of them slightly different. You have the kind of a steeper angle here, and as we come out from that point, it kind of radiates out, and it starts to become increasingly horizontal. And so this is a steeper angle, or I guess a shallower angle from our perspective than this one here. So that, again, we're just kind of building an intuition for that because these vanishing points are so far off the page. Now, again, we're constantly confronting the difference between the literal truth and the optical truth. So we know literally that this side of the barn, this edge of the barn and this edge of the barn are parallel with one another. What our brain is doing is when we see a three-dimensional object, it's more useful for us to understand that these edges are parallel with one another. But optically, they're not. So our brain fixes it for us. So from this point of view, optically, these lines are at distinctly different angles. But our brain says, that's not very helpful for us. Because if I don't want to think of this barn as having these sloped sides, because it doesn't. And so it corrects that perspective in our minds, and it tells us that those are parallel. So we're often kind of defaulting to the literal truth of the subject. So sometimes it's hard to see it as angles like this until you kind of practice a little bit. So if you're struggling a little bit with this early step in kind of mapping out your drawing, kind of stick with it and ask yourself, what am I really doing? Am I really drawing the optical truth, or am I drawing the literal truth? And it's a challenge. Everybody handles it a little bit differently, but you're going to find your own way through there. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to forget that we're drawing a barn here. We're just drawing a shape. We're drawing shapes, lines, and edges. And then out of that, we're creating an illusion on the page so that the viewer is going to come to this, and it's going to go through the same process of evaluating this drawing as it would in evaluating an actual barn. So it's going to correct the perspective. Rather than seeing these as literally as different angles, it's going to assume that it's actually an optical situation. It's going to apply that same processing of the optical truth to this and see that as edges of a parallel barn just drawn in perspective. So hopefully that makes sense. It gets really tricky. So we take a barn, when we're drawing in a perspective, those edges, those are literally parallel. We're drawing them as slightly different angles. And then when we look at the paper, these are literally as slightly different angles, but optically it'll create the impression of that this is a three-dimensional object in perspective. Right? And so your brain is going to see them as actually parallel on an object that's in space. So that's the magic of drawing there. All right, back to it. I'm going to draw this, start to draw this roof, which is basically or this roof element, which is basically a smaller version of this barn. It's a thinner one. Here I can use some additional tools. So I'm starting with that back roof line. And then I'm drawing these vertical edges. That's too high there. That's going to throw me off. And I'm creating that basically as a box. So this line doesn't exist in the reference photo, but what it does is it connects the eaves, the overhangs of that sloped roof. So I'm creating an imaginary line that connects the bottom corners of the roof, and an imaginary line that connects the bend. And in seeing that, they become parallel to the roof and that base, so that should fit within the rules of perspective as well. I can also use, I can pay attention to the positive and negative space here, so look at this shape here and determine at what point along this roof line does this roof emerge. And then I can adjust using the angle sighting. And I think I'm pretty well in the ballpark. So I rely so much more on angle sighting than actually mapping out a vanishing point. That's just the process that I work. But you may be a little bit different. Maybe you want to dial it in and actually extend your work surface with a long straight edge, so you can actually calculate and make sure that these meet at a common point. I feel like for me, I've generally been served well by just treating them as, as long as I'm in the ballpark, as I'm getting close, then I should be all right. Okay, so now I've got the basic proportions mapped out. Now I can start to map out the light and shadow. Oh, I forgot this one other line here. There we go. And so just double check that angle here with some angle sighting. And then what I want to do is I want to block this in, and I can let these marks here just run a little long. All right, so I have the rough shape blocked in, rough sense of light and shadow, and now we're going to sharpen it up. Again, we have an understanding now of the basic perspective, and we can go through the process of clarifying it. So I'm going to take my paper towel, smooth this out a little bit. I'm not worried about preserving edges, because that's going to be the next step, is kind of sharpening it. And you may have to go through the angle sighting again. If we're losing some of those edges, it's okay to do it again. It doesn't take very much time to reestablish it, and it's always a good idea to evaluate it again. Oh, and I forgot this here. There's this shadow here. So I'm actually going to switch to the compressed charcoal, using an overhand grip in this side to engage the side of it. Going to block in some of that, and then when I'm blocking in. And I'm blocking in the shadow here. Now I might as well kind of run these lines so that they reinforce the perspective. So we talked about building that intuition for perspective. When you're blocking in here, we know that this top edge and this bottom edge have their distinct angles, and we can kind of radiate, we can kind of transition between them. And even though it's all very subtle, it can be helpful in reinforcing that perspective to have some of those marks there. It's kind of like establishing some cross contour information. So this is partly to darken in, but I think mostly it's just to get some kind of more permanent marks on there. All right, so again, just a rough block in. Now I can kind of rough in some of the boards here. I'm going to keep this very light because I want this to stay in light, not the shadow. So I don't want that. I got to contort myself a little bit. There we go. So you can see the image starting to emerge already. So as we're placing that top of the door, what I'm looking at are these two angles here and trying to find a line that kind of fits within that. So there's this switch that happens in your brain when you're drawing in perspective, where all of a sudden you see this as a three-dimensional object, not two-dimensional marks, or marks on a two-dimensional surface. And it can, as you build that basic understanding of and get a feel for perspective, when you're drawing a mark like this, kind of freehand without using angle sighting or anything, you're putting it in the context of a three-dimensional form. It's going to feel off. If I made a line like this, it's going to feel off because my brain is already thinking this as three-dimensional. But you still have to pay attention to that and make sure that you're kind of seeing the whole face of the barn, not just that angle in isolation. You want to really step back and not focus too much at this stage. That focus actually will kind of distort things. So use blurred vision as much as you can. Do whatever you can to kind of reduce the reliance on sharp focus. Light touch here just to establish some texture there. All right, so let's go through now. As we refine this drawing farther, the details will start to emerge. So this is where this card comes in handy. So I prefer to use it as a masking tool more than anything. So I'll use it like this. I'll use a vanish eraser, kind of protect that edge. And I can double check. Just do a quick check-in against the reference photo. And you can see that I'm sharpening up those edges without drawing a line. And for me, that becomes really important because I don't want the bulk to build up. That's just kind of part of my process that I've known that if I stick with drawing lines for the edges, then it just gets really bulky on the drawing. Just kind of locking in that. Okay, just double checking the angles again before I commit. You can always adjust. But in this way, again, it's sharpening the edges without contributing to the bulk of the drawing. So just working my way through the drawing. I'm having a hard time seeing over the edge there, so I need to look at that. Look at the overhead projection. I'm just checking kind of parallel with the side of the paper quickly to make sure my vertical edge is proper. And so in general, yeah, I'm masking on top of on top of the charcoal and then erasing the outer edge. But you can also, you use this as a masking tool in this way. So place it over the light side and then bring your charcoal right up to it if you need. And then doing it this way also helps me to really manage those edges a bit more effectively to create some variety. If I draw a line down there, I run the risk of it being too hard and consistent and flattening that depth. My goal is to create depth here. So here, now I can mask in reverse, use my blending stump, and start to block in the shadow shapes. And so this is a well-used blending stump, so it's really loaded with charcoal, and so it's making some really nice marks. If you've got a new one, you might have to season it a little bit. What I'm doing here though is you can see that I've eliminated any sort of thickness to the roof, and so we'll reestablish that, but I blocked that in as a solid form. Here, I need to establish the thickness of the roof here, so I'm going to bring this down, show a little bit of that edge, then scooch it over. And I am just kind of blocking in, and now the roof, letting that run a little bit long, trying to think through the overall perspective of the roof. So if I'm aligning, I'm using cross hatching, but I'm choosing the angles specifically so that they reinforce that roof. And there's some kind of unevenness. It's not a solid value, and that's fine, because if you look at the reference photo, there's these subtle streaks and things like that in the roof that that we can actually we can start to replicate just through happy accidents on the page. So have a light touch here, bearing down a little bit more here in the shadow. And then the same, there's a bit of value here, so we'll come through and we'll refine this even farther. So I'm not too worried about it being precious with the marks at this phase. You know, again, there's going to be continual refinement throughout the whole process. So I kind of lost the definition between the roof line and that shadow here. So I'm going to treat that as all one shadow shape, and then I'll define that. I'll find that angle again. And then let me reestablish the thickness of the roof. And there's a bit of an overlap there. So I'm just going to mask this. And as I'm going through here, I'm rolling the blending stump here in my fingers so that I'm constantly distributing and picking up charcoal kind of evenly around the whole thing, around the whole blending stump. Actually, I'm gonna run these long, and then kind of cut that back there, just like that. So again, creating that edge by masking rather than drawing a hard line. Now I can do the same, I can smudge in here, so I'm not worried about it being a consistent form. Again, this is a rather irregular shape. There's a lot of kind of patina on this barn. And so I want to capture the character of that and allow, so here those marks that I used to find perspective center become useful in establishing those running stain marks down the front of the barn. So I'm not matching the reference one-to-one, but it'll be sufficient for capturing the kind of the spirit of the place. All right, so now I'm going to let this, so I could go through it right now and kind of clean up all of these loose edges, but I tell you what's going to happen is I'm going to smudge all of this as I draw. So it'll just be kind of wasted effort. So I'm going to kind of I'm going to hold off on that. There's so much in my brain that says clean it, clean it, clean it, but I know right now I don't have the time to monkey around with all of that. So I am just going to let that sit, let it be, and start to go through and refine this. So we're cranking along here, and we're making some good progress. I do need to sharpen this edge though, so this is where we're going to target the drawing and target the refinement. I'm going to work my way across, kind of adding a greater degree of refinement to all of these forms here. So on this side, we talked about the kind of the thickness of the roof that I ignored. And so right now it's just a solid value. But there's a bit of light that catches on the lip, and then it falls into shadow, and then you have some bounce light in here. So you have a shadow core that's right in here, just away from the farthest left edge, and then a mid value. But before I start to lift any of those lighter values, I want to go dark first. And so that's going to be something that's fairly consistent in this process, is when we're in shadow areas, add the darks first, see where you're at, and then lift light if you need to. So I just kind of masked a little bit in, set in, to give myself some of that thickness there in the roof. And just by adding a darker dark, it automatically makes that previous value now read as a light. And I'm going to come back in and make it a little bit darker, a little bit lighter. That light should be a little bit lighter, but again, we want to start with the darks first. So as I focus on that edge, I'm just going to lean my elbow on this so that I lift my hand off the paper. Kind of trim that corner a little bit. Now, I'm going to mask on this side so I can really see the edge. And then with the sharpened eraser, I can come in and really clean up that edge. Now that angle has migrated, I think. Oh, maybe not. Maybe it's all right. So if I need to lift any light now along in here, I can kind of gently tap and create a little bit more separation, more contrast along that edge. And I'm just going to do that in a few small areas rather than a hard, consistent line. Come in here with the blending stump, smooth this out, and drag down on that wall to create the overhang. And now that previous value, it felt darker than it actually is. So sometimes when you simply provide a little bit more context for your values by adding another value next to it, then all of a sudden it just changes your values. All right, so I'm going to, with this window, I've got that rough form, and then there's some light that catches on the wood trim. So I'm going to darken kind of right up just inside that edge, leave a little bit of thickness there. Smooth this a little bit. Now I'm going to use the side of this blending stump to start to suggest some of the kind of the details. Now this window is too square, so I can bring that down. That feels a little bit more appropriate. I can, kind of going back to that, I can use my blending stump for a lot of the next step here. What I like about the blending stump is it allows me to, it's a bit more gentle. Right, so I'm gonna be focusing on this side and just be aware again of that radiating quality of the lines. This line here is distracting because it's not supposed to be there. Okay, there we go. I'm going to start by working on this area here where it's a little bit darker. There's a shift in the wood. I'm going to mask it, straighten up some of those edges. And I'm not worried about kind of broken edges at all. Broken lines. We're really good at connecting lines that seem to be that are broken on the page. So we'll see two different pieces, and we'll visually kind of connect them together. So with this side of the wall, there are all these little kind of tiles here that are staggered, that are overlapping, and I'm just dropping in kind of some of these vertical divisions. On these vertically here, carrying some of those marks into the shadow as well to create some transparency there. And I'm largely kind of making this up as I go. So this is a point at which you might prefer to become more truthful to the reference photo. I'm just using it as a launching off point, and I'm trying to capture the basic texture, but I'm not getting bogged down in really mapping out all the details. But what's important when you're working with this texture is that you want it to be in service of the perspective. So you're using it to reinforce the perspective of the plane. If you think about it that way, then it prevents you from getting lost in all of those fine textures and then kind of ending your drawing with it all at the wrong angle, or kind of not quite aligning with that surface. So we have that plane established, and what I'm thinking about right now is how can I use that texture to make that plane even more understandable, if that makes sense. I'm not using it, I'm not really thinking about it as, oh, I need this to make a cool drawing. I need this to make a stronger three-dimensional object, essentially. Now, I'm not being super precise with this, and one of the reasons is, I can let some of these lines angle a little bit, and that's kind of keeping in character with the barn. The barn itself has got these boards that are starting to become askew. As this thing settles, it's no longer parallel with the plane. So you can see that there's this kind of foundation here. You've got the ground itself that kind of swells. It's not perfectly flat. But I think that the main thing is to then step back from your work and say, does this make sense as a three-dimensional object? Running these vertically here. And then you have this white bar here that the barn doors hang from. So just using the eraser to kind of sharpen up some of these edges here. Not cleaning it up too much because, again, it adds to kind of the patina of the drawing of that barn. And now I can go back in and I can drop in some of that, the thin shadows here. So instead of just drawing a line down here, I've masked off that edge. And I'm kind of sneaking up on it. I'm kind of running those lines horizontally. And that prevents me from drawing too strong of a line. So right in here, there's some transparency, that shadow. It's a little bit darker where it overlaps that darker wood, so I can carry that through. See. So I'm just switching back and forth between the blending stump and the charcoal and then the eraser. Kind of sharpening edges with the eraser. modulating the value with the blending stump, and building material using the charcoal. Okay, so now I can come back here. I can mask. Oh, I kind of dropped that shadow right on top of that white bar that I erased out earlier. So I can find the right edge of that there. And as I drop that line, I'm just kind of tapping along that edge. It's really kind of broken. It's not a hard, straight, consistent line, but I think it just adds to the character of the drawing. And I can then draw this shadow here, again, masking off the door. And then running these lines so that they align with the flow, the grain of the wood siding there. And we have a shadow for that door. And now with your charcoal, you can go in and you can start to add a little bit more texture to the wood. And there are these spots, where you can see between the slats and they get a little dark. So I'm not doing that. I'm not doing it kind of consistently and evenly. I'm jumping all over the place to prevent myself from drawing kind of stripes, essentially, which is what I want to avoid. I want to avoid any sort of pattern forming. And then using the side of the pencil kind of to discourage kind of a heavy hand. I want to keep this light. You can get away with so much by just tapping. And again, you're just letting then the marks, the viewer kind of look at those marks and create connections between them. And then, so this is again where you can kind of sit with the drawing and continue to add details. I don't want to spend too much time. I want to get into the next phase here. It would also be helpful to be able to rotate the paper, but I can't really do that here. And adding some of that texture there. Again, kind of suggesting what, and kind of building from the kind of the rough observations that I'm making, but I'm not being too picky and precise if I've misplaced any of that patina from the side of the house. And then I think I want to kind of give a bit of a wash here to that corner. So what I'm doing is just thinking about a gradation, making it a little bit lighter towards that front. We can come back in with the eraser and sharpen up some of those edges. So rather than just scoring a line down, I'm kind of tentatively moving up along that edge, creating that broken edge. And here, just kind of placing that eraser against that edge and then pushing back in. And so what I'm feeling is that it feels like the light catches a little bit more in here, in this lower corner, a little bit darker up in this corner. So there's a gradation happening. And part of that is just because of the fundamental value relationships of this being darker here on the ground against that light, and then this being darker here, and gradually catching some bounce light back here. So there's a transition in value that's fairly subtle. So I can kind of sharpen right in along that corner. All right, so now I'm going to start kind of from that top, work my way down. And darken in this roof line a little bit and then come back in and sharpen, darken and sharpen. So then, as I work on this, I think I feel like it gets darker here, gradually lighter as we come forward, and then it kind of catches the light right in here. So this is the point where I'm also realizing that I'm going to be coming in later with the white charcoal, and that's going to give me an opportunity there to create some additional contrast. So I got to account for the thickness of the roof here. I'm going to bring this corner forward a little bit, darken that, and then I can add that window here. Trying to think about the slope, thinking about that perspective. So this window, those top and bottom edges are parallel with the roof lines. So again, it needs to radiate out from that vanishing point. So I'm not measuring it specifically, but I'm asking myself, if I were to follow that kind of radiating quality of these edges, these are going to be steeper than what I'm seeing down in here. I can reestablish that. That did not work. Okay, there we go. That's better. I'm going to use my eraser to kind of establish this weather stripping here. And then blend with the blending stump. And then use this to kind of reestablish, kind of work on some of that texture there, reestablish the edge of the shadow. Now I need to, oh, wrong one. I think I need to kind of darken here at the front and darken that roof line a little bit. Use the blending stump to kind of establish a little bit of a ridge on that corner. And then what I'm going to do, this is a bit kind of clumsy here. I'm going to sharpen up the corners a little bit. Rather than redraw the lines, I'm just going to target the bends and the corners and see what that gets me. See if that sharpens up the edges sufficiently. Create the impression of it not being so kind of bulky and kind of rounded in some of those areas. So just using kind of the power of suggestion, which can be really handy. It's one of the things that excites me in drawing and painting, is when there's nothing drawn or painted, yet I see it. My brain is filled in that missing information. And so that's kind of what's happening here, is I'm just kind of working my way around and seeing where can I drop a dot here, a dot there, to suggest something and allow the viewer's mind to fill it in. Now that if you're inclined, if you want that experience to get in there and do every detail, you got to do that, and just kind of keep in mind that, you know, all of that detail and those subtle refinements. Just keep serving the overall perspective. All right. But I kind of, sometimes I'll treat that like a challenge to say, like, how little can I actually get away with, or how much can I get away with as few marks as possible. So So that's why I kind of sneak up on it a little bit. So in this front corner, for example, I can start by placing a dot and see how that reads. Does that feel like it sharpens that edge up? This feels a bit fuzzy, so I can do the same here. Kind of identify that bend, drop a dot in there. See if that sharpens it up. All right, so I think now what I want to do is, I've kind of lost the point on this, on my charcoal. I want to mask that off a bit. So I'm going to utilize the side. I still have another stick of charcoal that I can use. But so far this seems to be holding pretty well. I do want to sharpen this up a little bit. So I'm going to do that same type of thinking. Just to kind of sharpen up that edge with the eraser. Mask this off, and I'm darkening the front side, the front portion of this roof line. Kind of gradually receding as we go back. I'm just going to go right over that edge of the wall, because I'm being fairly light with it. And I can use the eraser in that same kind of thinking as with those dots, just in a few areas I can kind of sharpen that edge up and create that thickness on that roof line. All right, so now we're at a situation where I need to create some definition on this wall over here. And one of the things I'm observing is that there's all that fun, the variety in the painting and the texture of the wood. And so, again, I'm going to go for the darks first before I lighten anything. So I'm seeing all that white paint, but I don't want to lift that yet until I've gone with my darkest dark, till I've established that as a context. So as I do that, that starts to create some impression of the bounce light. Oh, I didn't put this center line in here. I think I need to actually, my blending stump is kind of losing some of its load, some of the charcoal loaded onto it. So actually I want to sharpen up this a little bit. There we go. Okay, so again, I've got all that white paint in there, but I want to make sure that at first it's got to stay in shadow. It's got to read as shadow. If I lighten that too much, then it's going to compete with some of the light. So that's why I'm kind of sneaking up on it. The darkest darks, there's these cool little kind of windows here that are slightly above the eye level, so they kind of angle down. It's really easy to lose sight of where I'm at in terms of the perspective. So again, I got to kind of double check where is everything relative to eye level. So I'm kind of just holding in my mind, again, the lines of perspective there. So using this eraser, I can start to lift off some of the light areas that are kind of catching that, but I'm just starting with a really light touch. So I'm kind of almost just floating over the page to make sure that I'm aware of the overall perspective, and that these marks are reinforcing the angle of that wall and not conflicting with it. And so then there's this quality that, you know, again, these lines that kind of follow along in there, but then there's also a vertical nature to this wall. And so you can run your marks vertically as well as in alignment with the perspective. I'm going to come back in here and add a little bit more contrast, kind of drop in some of these areas where it feels like where the wood gets, there gets these darker spots in the wood, add some more of that texture. I need to really try to prioritize this front edge, I think. I'm going to smooth this out. And the key to reinforcing the depth in your drawing is to really look at those edges and create a sense of variety. So ask yourself as you follow along that edge, is there a change that happens frequently? So you're looking at the relationship between these two forms and ask yourself, is there something that kind of changes regularly? And that's one of the reasons why I'm avoiding drawing a line, because a line, it creates a consistent edge that I'm going to then have to combat later. And so I want to make sure that I'm starting with a sense of variety and then building into more greater consistency. So I mean, I think that's probably far enough for now. I'm going to actually switch out my pencil since I'm losing some of that edge. I can add a little bit of more refinement using this kind of sharper pencil. I can mask here, and then just in a few areas, bring in a bit more refinement if I want to sharpen that up. I can mask this. This still feels a little bit hazy. See how that reads. That gives it a little bit more definition there. And I'm just going through and adding a bit more refinement with an edge that's a little bit sharper. Adding some of that texture along in here. And then right in here, kind of drop down some texture from that. All right, so now I can start to address the landscape. And I'm going to keep this relatively loose. The big thing here is, again, observing those value relationships. So as we look at this ground plane, as you squint at the ground plane, you can see that there's really a strong shadow shape. You have a light sky and then this big block of shadow and a big block of shadow on the ground. And I've lifted off a lot of that vine charcoal. But what's important here is to observe this value relationship, how this is darker than that. And then that creates that sense of bounce light in the barn. So we still have the barn in shadow, but it's now that shadow has greater definition. You see what that does to really drop that value down. And we have the same over here. So I'm just going to be kind of looser with that landscape. I don't want it to compete with the barn, and I'm running a little short on time, so I need to pick up the pace a little bit. And I'm kind of lightly scraping, allowing the tooth of the paper to do some of the work for me in terms of creating some texture, and that creates a little bit of contrast as well against the barn now, which has been smoothed out a little bit. Okay, so what I'm looking at though, what's most critical here is I need to make sure that the barn feels like it's sitting properly on the ground. So I still need to pay attention to the perspective systems. If I think ground is separate from the building and I draw it at a different perspective, it's going to feel like they're not quite aligned. And that's because I wouldn't have paid attention to it. The drawing is just replicating what's happening in my mind. So if I'm holding in my mind the nature, the perspective of the ground, that will help. So what I'm looking at is, because we're fairly low to the ground, all of these lines are kind of being squished together. We're looking across that ground plane. There's this road that kind of wraps around the front here. And I'm mostly gonna go by feel. If I look at the barn, this is where the indirect gaze becomes really helpful. If I look at the barn, but I put my awareness on the landscape, does it feel like it connects? So I'm staring at the drawing, looking at the barn, but asking myself questions about the landscape. Does it feel believable, or does it catch my attention because it seems off? So I'm just keeping this really loose and sketchy. And you can use angle sighting to get some of these main forms established. Now it creates this really nice effect of light and shadow. It's already making that sky feel more luminous now that we have kind of that darker ground. Got my paper towel I should be using. Just smoothing it out, but I'm trying not to push too hard, because I do want that tooth of the paper to play a role. That just kind of averages out the value. And then I can come back in and drop more work in there. If I can use this to, and some of those areas that I missed. I do want that tooth of the paper to play a role, but I think it was just too much contrast to showing the natural tone of the paper through there. So wiping it down helps to knock down that high value, and now I can come back in and reestablish some of that texture. So what I'm looking at is just how flat some of these marks are across here, across that plane. They're really squished together here. And then there's a bit of a rounded quality to the grass as we start to work our way up to the road. And it's almost like one of the things I'll do is I'll kind of envision a grid on the ground plane, kind of understanding where the vanishing points are, and then loosely referencing those as I'm making my marks. I don't want to physically draw a grid, but if I know in general, like if I were to place a grid here, the marks would kind of radiate out like this, then I can reinforce the perspective by just slightly adjusting my marks. And the same with this here. If the road is parallel to the barn, then it would kind of roughly align with that vanishing point off to the far right there. And then the road kind of rounds out a little bit here. So I've kind of amplified that slope a little bit, but I think that works out okay. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of cropping off that far right just so that we could focus on the barn a little bit more, but you might have more room here to really draw that road in. And then there's kind of just a few little stretches here on the road that seem to catch the light a little bit more. the broken edges are really kind of critical in here to suggest that landscape. So I don't know if I'm going to do much more work to that, because I do want to kind of move this thing along a little bit more. But what do I need to do? There's something off in here. So this is what I need to do. I need to establish the horizon line a little bit better here. And I can smooth that out since it's so much farther away. That will help to create some of that depth, to have that softer edge and softer texture. And then there's a little bit of light that kind of catches around the side of the barn. So what I'm thinking about right now is that we have just this short edge here where we have the relationship between the barn and the landscape. That landscape, there's almost a half a mile or so of landscape that gets accounted for in just this tiny bit. And so right now it's too consistent, and that's popping it forward, it's shortening that gap. If I want to open that up, I need to create more variety along that edge. So there are spots here where the light seems to catch in that landscape, and in some areas more than others. Right in here, for example, there's light catching on that grass. So that there's just a small area, but I feel like that's doing a lot of work in terms of creating that depth, and so I need to pay attention to that. All right, so there we have that. That feels a little bit better. Again, just breaking up that edge there. I can do that along in here as well. There's some sort of element in here that's kind of catching light, and then catching casting a shadow right in here. So again, breaking up that edge. And that helps to push that landscape back behind there. All right, so now I can clean up the sky area with the kneaded eraser. I'm glad I didn't do that earlier, because I just would have made a mess of it anyways. And we can bring in the white charcoal. So let me swap this out, because I just have my little nub. And I'll start on this side here. There's a tree there that I'm going to put in there, but it's going to be difficult to work around the tree with this white. So I'm going to sharpen that up. Now, as I do this, I need to pay attention to the direction of the marks and see how that's working, to see if it's separating from the barn at all. So I might need to try a few different directional marks to see what happens. So what I mean by that is that I want this sky to be behind this edge. And if I run my marks vertically, and the viewer is going to look at this vertical edge and say, oh, if those marks run vertically and you have a vertical edge, they must belong together. So in this way, it's actually most effective to run them horizontally. So I'm going to mask off that roof line and then just create a gradation up here. So with that gradation, just kind of work back and forth. Kind of smoothing it out as you go. Now that edge is a little fuzzy, so I can come back in here and sharpen it up a little bit. So just with the white charcoal and a light touch, kind of come in along there. Kind of prioritize the corner a little bit. And then it's really helpful to look, as I look up, I can see there's some unevenness to the white, and so in it that I can't see from this point of view, but when I look up, I can see it. The light is catching it a little bit differently. So that's one of the things to pay attention to when you're working with the white charcoal, is to is how it affects, how it's affected by the light. So I'm letting this edge here be a bit soft. That helps to push that back against that sharper edge of the barn. And I can come back over here, and I'll add some more of that white here. So I'm going to use the circular marks to kind of get into that nook. So they're omnidirectional. And then kind of peel away from that edge a little bit. So I can mask this again, just like I did before. And so right now, with the way the light is glaring, I can't see anything that's happening on my page in front of me, but when I look up, I can see how the white is being deposited. And as I come up to around that roof line, I think that's probably all right. I kind of like that it's a little bit heavier on this side. It's not a consistent line of value here. So that right there does quite a bit to separate and pull that barn forward. But I do want to now account for some of the light that is catching on the side. But I want to be careful. I want to add just it kind of sparingly to reinforce some of the texture. And maybe sharpen, things like right in here. I can bring that corner forward a bit. There's a feeling that the light kind of is a bit of a gradation. It's a little bit stronger on this front corner. So I'm going to push that a little bit farther. And just keeping my marks light and loose, because that whole barn has got that cool patina. It's not smooth and even. And it really catches on this door for some reason, which is cool. So I'm just thinking about where can I add this that helps to increase the definition, can refine it a little bit farther. And then evaluating, is it competing with that sky? Does the sky still push back? Is there enough separation between the sky and the barn? And is there an opportunity for me to kind of sharpen this up a little bit more? So right here on the corner, for example, I can break up that corner. If I drop in a hit of kind of brighter white, that's going to increase the contrast there, and again pop that forward a little bit. And I want to dart around the whole drawing, and because I don't want to get fixated in one spot too much. Here's an opportunity to, so here, since that sky is darker, here's an opportunity to play around with some of the value kind of fluctuation. And that kind of pushes, it might be a little bit strong, but it brings that roof line forward, pushes this back. And I find it more effective to kind of bounce around the whole drawing at this stage rather than get locked in on one spot and then kind of finish as we go. Keep darting around the whole drawing. This is all a very light touch because I don't want it to be too intense. again, avoid when you're working on this barn. I just felt myself kind of fighting the urge to create these stripes on the wall. So if you're in that same, if you're kind of in that same mode of thinking, just be careful not to add stripes. There we go. So I think this is probably good for now. You know, there might be some kind of slight issues with the overall proportions, but I feel like we captured the basic perspective. I feel like we captured the kind of the texture and the spirit of this barn effectively. And that's the whole goal, is to just to kind of practice drawing in perspective a little bit, give ourselves this challenge. You can go back in and add some of the fine details like these little antenna things. And so when I'm thinking about creating them, just kind of tapping on the page more than really drawing. Keep them light and loose. Oh, I didn't add the tree. You could add the tree. I'm just going to use the side of the pencil to kind of suggest it. I don't know if you want to, I don't want to move it too close. Actually, what I want to do, this is an opportunity to break that edge, so I can bring that right behind that edge of the barn. In that way, it breaks up that edge and hopefully creates even more dimension and depth. You can add some of the trees back here to balance out the composition if you want, but you can kind of play around with things. You know, I didn't add the windmills, of course, but so hopefully this made sense. This has been a lot of fun. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you live today, but we will be back again next Wednesday, again 3 p.m. Eastern. This is Drawing Together. I would love to see your work, so share the drawings on the link that's in the description below. You'll find that link to the show page for this episode, along with the reference image, the list of materials that I'm using, etc. So this has been a blast. I look forward to seeing you all live next week, I hope. So have a great week, have fun drawing, and I'll see you then.